Okay, so this is part two of our unit on sensation and perception. And if you recall, we gave an overview of the main parts of this unit. And we covered in the first video the basic concepts. And we're going to proceed now to look at vision and hearing primarily, if not totally, I should say, in this section. There are other things that we could talk about like touch, smell, taste, and then multimodal perception. But we had referred to that a little bit under basic concepts, so we will spend the majority of our time just isolating today vision and hearing. So you see up in front of you the slide with the swirling skull with the cerebral hemisphere in it, and then the eye and the components of the eye. And we do want to look at sensation and perception with respect to vision. So what does the sense of vision accomplish, and what is the sense of vision? We don't usually speak about vision that way, as though, well, we have a sense of vision. We usually just say we see things. So we're trying to break that down a little bit, and I think you could easily Google and find just a lot of information about the eye. Just really, really fascinating if you're into that, or even if you're not, it's worth just taking a peek. We think of God's creation, and when we do, we think of God as this master designer in some sense, because of everything he created has this complex design. And you could look on the macro level, you could look on the micro level. On the macro level, you could look at what astrophysicists quantify as being great distances and between stellar bodies and deep into space and so on and so forth. And you just see the great complexity, of God's creation. But there are a couple of ways even to look at that, because you have complexity in the sense of chaos, lack of order, but it's still complex. But then you can see complexity in the sense of specificity, or what we call specified complexity. The difference is you take a piece of paper and you throw a bunch of letters of the alphabet all over the place, and you say, okay, fine, it's complex. It's complex, but it's also incoherent. And yet that same sort of garbled bunch of letters, when it's put together with proper syntax, let's say in the English language, proper syntax of grammar, punctuation, spacing, and all those things, you have perfectly comprehensible order. And that's what God has done in creation. Now, true, and we've got this virus running rampant and a pandemic and all these things, and things might seem rather chaotic and disorderly, but you really need to take a step back from all of this to get a much broader perspective. And you can see that even in a sin-darkened, sin-stained, sin-disrupted, sin-damaged world, there's incredible specificity, there's incredible complexity, and there is incredible and powerful evidence of God's creativity and of the existence of a creator. And I say all that to point in front of you to this eye, or the eyeball, one of two that we have, and the various parts. And this is only skimming the surface of the parts. And when you look at how the eye functions, there's incredible design that allows the sense of sight to be the stimulus that allows the sense of sight to communicate to the brain, and we have this ensuing vision. It's truly remarkable. I mean, think of the most complex camera. I have I'm not saying this is an example, but some years ago my wife gave me a DSLR, I think it's a Canon EOS, one of those Rebel types or whatever. And I got that, and I thought, my word, I don't know how to use this thing. You hit the menu, and there's so many things on it. All I really knew how to do at the time was just point and click, and this thing would autofocus and all that. But if you take the lens out and you're looking at the mirror inside, and some are mirrorless now, the SLRs and a whole range of different cameras. If someone wants to explain to you just how photography is done, it just pales in explanation to how vision works and how that we're able to see. And again, this is just a great testimony to God's creation and to, I mentioned the macro level in the sense of the universe and the sheer vastness of the universe. It seems infinite, but we know that it's not. And yet, when we think on the micro level and we look at, for example, protein molecules and DNA, the language of life, so to speak, and on all the complexity, the specified complexity, because you see, there's no randomness. Where is the randomness? Can't say it too early. Where is the randomness here? Like the ad hoc. Yeah, all this stuff just sort of came together, and truly we see the handiwork of God here. So enough said, sort of. But we need to look at vision. The slide before you, what it is, what it accomplishes. So just a brief overview. The idea the light enters into the pupil, it gets converted into electrical signals. So now this is going back to the remember the axons and all that we looked at. We'll touch on that ever so more briefly in a moment. But the neurotransmitters and just so we got a sense of how the axons carry these electrical signals. It's kind of the conveyance for this. So you have the stimuli, the signal, and it delivers this sense of vision as it's communicated through the brain. And now you look at the eye, where light then, which is the stimulus then, light, and it's sensed, through the eye. So it enters the pupil, it gets converted into electrical signals by what are called, and you see the terms there, I think, well, maybe not. No, I don't think they're there. Rods and cones, and we'll explain those in a minute. Rods and cones, what they are, and how they relate to sight or clarity of sight, and this would be probably the next slide in terms of in darkness or in light, and how the eye adjusts and so on. How does that happen anyway? So things like rods and cones then are responsible in relating all of this information to or in the retina, which is in the back of the eye, and we'll go over this a little bit more detail. So we'll speak in a moment about the difference between rods and cones, but the fact that we have two eyes then present our brain with two slightly different images. And I'm sure you've experienced that in the past, covering one eye, then covering the other eye, and just seeing a slight difference then in what one eye sees over the other. But then with both eyes open, looking at the same object, how is it that the eyes don't switch back and forth, switch back and forth, switch back and forth like they do when you're covering one? And that's called binocular disparity. Binocular disparity. And let me just speak about that for a moment, and then we'll talk about how all of this information then gets sent to the primary visual cortex, which you're looking at this spinning in front of you. That red, you see right there. See that red? We're talking about the primary visual cortex in the brain, and how all this information somehow gets communicated to that, and then what happens. So I want to speak for a moment about just for a moment on binocular disparity, what that is, having two eyes, and how that phenomenon called this thing you experience, in other words, called binocular disparity functions. And then we'll go back up top and look at the difference between these various parts of the eye, and see if we can appreciate, I guess, because we're probably not going to appreciate the science as much as we appreciate the handiwork of God, and just how He made, designed, if you will, this one part of the human body, and it's not just true of the one part, but everything else, and then how all of that sort of functions together in kind of what we call a multimodal way, right? So binocular disparity, or this would be, by disparity, we mean the lack of similarity between the two, or a difference between something. So why don't you just say difference then? Well, because the term is disparity. So I guess we have to learn new terms. There's a point at which if we're going to learn new stuff, we can't just keep simplifying everything. But binocular disparity, the slight difference between the right and the left retinal images. What does that mean? The pictures that each one of your eye cameras are taking are slightly different. That is, when both eyes focus on the object, the different position of the eyes produces a disparity, hence binocular disparity, a disparity of visual angle, and a slightly different image is received by each retina. Hence, I see something different with each eye, but yet when you put those two together, I see one image. So we're just talking about the disparity here, not so much how it is that both eyes somehow convert or blend these two images into one. It's truly remarkable. Okay, so I mentioned the primary visual cortex. Yes, so you see that printed at the bottom right-hand side of the screen, primary visual cortex. So we should talk about this just a little bit. So the primary visual cortex, this is found in the occipital lobe of the brain. This is what you're seeing up there in both cerebral hemispheres. So what are you saying? You're seeing a skull, and you're seeing one of these. You're seeing one cerebral hemisphere. I have to get my mouth working today. One cerebral hemisphere. Now, what's the occipital lobe? Well, the occipital lobe is the rearmost of the brain. So you really don't see it identified there, but it is that rear area right there that contains the red. So the occipital lobe is considered to be the visual center of the brain. So all of these, if you will, the electrical signals emitted by the rods and cones in the retina, which is in not necessarily in the back, but you see the retina. The retina is covering about 2/3, 3/4 then of the eye, the interior, and so these the occipital lobe then is what receives all of this information and processes it into this visual sensation. So you'd say, well, okay, it's the visual center of the brain. And if we had just a slightly different image, you could Google this and find a great image, a better image. You'd see stripes, and we're not seeing those on this. We're just seeing the color to identify the location. But we'd see stripes. It would at least what appears to be stripes, and this is due to the axons. Remember those axons is those sort of long, almost cable-like. If we're going to say, hey, look at the cables that are carrying the electric current, something like that. Those axons appear as stripes, and they run along its edges. So this is the primary visual cortex, and the axons being then, that part of the nerve cell. Do you remember we looked at that a couple of sessions ago when we looked at the brain? The nerve cell that transmits impulses to other cells. So what have we talked about? Okay, Binocular disparity, we get that. We talked a little bit about light entering the pupil, being converted into electrical signals by rods and cones in the retina, in the back of the eye. You can see other parts there that are listed, and we kind of want to look at those just a little bit now. The pupil, the iris, the lens, the retina, the optical nerve, and the fovea. If we could just look at those just a bit, and again, get some appreciation for vision that we really take for granted. How often do we really stop and think how valuable it is to have vision, and thank God that He has given us vision. There are people who are vision impaired. As you get older, you'll have to do what I do, and that's wear glasses. And if you have prescription glasses, some of you, or contacts or something, it's because your vision is impaired in some way. And so you do that to try to get back to what's 20/20 your normal vision for you. Because we appreciate our vision, and we need our vision. We need our vision to obtain information, to see things. And just like we'll talk about hearing in a moment, imagine if you're sightless and you're unable to hear, either temporarily or permanently. I can remember some years ago, I was in my early 40s, which seems like 100 years ago now, but standing in the pulpit, and especially the evening services, when in that auditorium the lights were really not that bright, and so you'd need some type of light on your pulpit, but even with that was a struggle. And the print in my Bible just seemed so small, and if I went to a larger print, I still struggled to see. And I went to the doctor, and he said, "Hey, Doug, you're getting that age, buddy. You're in your early 40s, where lower light, is going to result in an impairment of vision. So you're going to need a little help. So go over there to Walmart or wherever you go and get you a set of those readers, and that'll help you out." And that has. And so I went from probably the various magnifications, right? Like 1.25. And then from 1.25, I just kept going, 1.5, then 1.75 and 2 and so on. Right now I'm probably at 3 or 2.75 or 3, and it's okay if I'm just looking at something like a book in front of me on a table. But even when I'm in the classroom with you guys, it's things at a distance get blurry and of that nature. So you guys can appreciate that. Maybe even that I had pretty good vision at a younger age, but not everyone does. But what if you were totally sightless permanently? What if you could not hear permanently, or you lacked both of those? Just think of what the outside world, think of this, when we talk about sensation and senses. So let's say all you have is touch, smell, and taste. That's it. That's all you have, but you don't have vision, you don't have hearing, and we can begin to appreciate then how valuable our vision is. But just in general, to appreciate the wonder. I would use, it's probably not the proper use of the word miracle, but I would just say the miracle of sight. The best we can do with our cameras and everything else is mimic what God has already done. So God has given us the example, and then we mimic it, and look what we have. So let's talk about the pupil for just a moment. The pupil as being the part of the eye, or the opening. So this is the opening within the iris, and you see, you're just looking at these labeled parts in front of you, but this is the opening within the iris through which passes light before reaching the lens, and then being focused on the retina. Almost sounds like camera language, focus. But that's what we have here. Lens and focus and things of that nature, right? And how much does light depend on getting good quality photographs and things like that? So think about it. Here's the pupil. What does it do? It's an opening. It's just an opening, and it's an opening contained within the iris, and light passes through it, in order to reach the lens where it is focused on the retina. So it makes sense. I mean, so you're looking at the retina, sort of that inner sheath that it contains a lot of, sort of nerve activity, or is sort of, I want to say it's nervous, and I think that is the term. It's nervous in nature. Not that it twitters and shakes like a nervous person, but that it is primarily made up of nerve material, something like that. Well, so the second thing I would label is the iris, and you have it there. This is the muscular curtain near the front of the eye, and you can see there. So it's in red on the image in front of you. What next? How about the lens? The lens. Okay, the lens properly. This is a not bifocal or binocular, but biconvex structure. Biconvex. So what that means, biconvex, that means at both sides. Do you see, like, it's in blue, and you can see that sort of a convex shape, but it's on both sides. So it's like a spherical shape, but both sides are convex, hence biconvex. So the lens is a biconvex structure. It's suspended between the iris. Its purpose is to focus light rays onto the retina. So I'll stop there for just a second because I used the word purpose, and I just want to keep underscoring it. Got to get the mouth working, Doug. Underscoring it. The relation then between design and purpose. So we think like, well, the eye, the eye has a purpose so we can see. Well, that would be true, but then, you keep breaking this down. This is the wonder of God's creation. Keep breaking it down. The pupil itself has a purpose in relation to, let's say, the iris, which has a purpose, in relation to the lens, which has a purpose, in relation to the retina, which has a purpose, in relation to the optic nerve, which has a purpose, in relation to the fovea, and you're just talking about the eye. And you could say, well, all of that has purpose in relation to the primary visual cortex, which has a relation to the axons, which have a relation to, and you keep doing that. Truly remarkable, the connectivity of purpose that ultimately leaves us not to the, we could say to the perception of design, but I would go further and say the reality of design. What about the retina? So you see the retina. That's a North Carolina accent. The retina. This is a layer of tissue that covers the back 2/3. But if you're looking at it and you're seeing on either side of the lens, really, you're seeing the shape. It may even be a little bit more than that, but nonetheless, the covers the back 2/3 of the eyeball, and it's here that stimulation by light occurs. So light, as we say, that enters, through the pupil, gets focused onto the lens, and then further communicated down the line, right? That's the stimulation. So because we're saying that the retina is composed of nervous material, if I'm using that term right, I hope I am, but it's basically has the ability then to receive the sensation, and because of the nerve capability of it, is able to communicate that on. And so it begins then, initiates, let's say, in the retina, initiates the sensation of vision. I could just give you an example here. So I mentioned, being in the pulpit, but actually got a lot worse sometime after that. And I'm trying to remember, that might have been when I right around turning 50, somewhere in there. I would say 49, 50, about 10 years ago. And So I was lying in bed at the foot of the bed, you know, like many people. There's a television there, and I was just laying there relaxing. I think it was some late Sunday night, something like that. And so I'm laying there just relaxing. I sit up, just watching whatever, and I noticed that it was just strange. I had this strange sensation. I could see the image, but it was a strange sensation that I'd not experienced before. It was a little bit different than it's just blurry. So I did what any of you would do, kind of a self-test. So I put my hand over one eye and I could see it just perfectly. No problems. Put my hand over the other eye and I virtually had lost my sight in that eye. It was my left eye. That was a little scary because that wasn't like you can just fix this with readers. There was something seriously wrong. So a friend of mine who's a physician, ophthalmologist actually in Saratoga, one of those either One West or Two West, but at the time there was only One West if you're in Saratoga and you see these big buildings. I won't give his name, but I'll just tell you that we had gone to high school together, a tremendously gifted man. And so anyway, I went to see my old friend, and he looked at my eye and told me that I had some damage, and I can't tell you specifically, but it involved the retina and some of these other inner components of the eye where the fluid, no doubt all of the material in the inner eye then had pushed through. There was a tiny fracture or crack where it could just get through. This was no doubt the lens area and had seeped in to one eye, and so it was causing what we would use. Here's a big college term: an obfuscation. It was obfuscating my vision or blocking it in some way, and so they really couldn't do it. They could do something surgically, but it might leave scar tissue, and then that would mean permanent obfuscation. So they said, well, you just have to wait, and it will heal itself. The liquid material, the substance that was obfuscating would just move back out of there over time, but he says it could be up to a year. So that was a year of my life, with that type of impairment. So this is the retina initiating the sensation of vision. And you can imagine if that process is obstructed, you can trail it back then and say, well, this is why. So how about the optic nerve? You see that down towards the bottom, the optic nerve. So what does this thing do? I mean, why is it there? What is its purpose? So it carries sensory nerve impulses. You remember when we were studying the brain and these nerve cells and the axons and the neurotransmitters and the receptors and all that kind of stuff, right? And we mentioned that these are all or nothing type of impulses. So an impulse is emitted and that it is carried, and that happens through the optic nerve. Would it be hard to believe that there's more than 1 million ganglion cells in the retina? It's incredible. And this is what conveys conveys the information and certainly supports the visual centers of the brain. Fovea, then right at the bottom, fovea properly, it's called the fovea centralis, and it's a pit in the rear of the retina, and it contains no rods, but has the densest concentration of cones in the eye. So we need to look, just because I use these terms again, rods and cones, we should look at what these are in general and then what they are in particular as it relates then to the fovea. So the fovea contains these cones, but then there are rods as well elsewhere. So rods and cones, these are what we'd call photoreceptors. Now we've kind of heard the words receptor before, so photo isn't too much of a leap to attach that term. Photo having to do with like photon or light, something like that. So rods and cones are two types of photoreceptors, and they are located in the retina, along with nerves that tell the brain what the photoreceptors are seeing. So first, let's talk about rods for a second. So rods work at a very low level of light, and they help with night vision. In other words, both rods and cones are activated by very specific stimuli. So what are we saying about rods then? That when you're in a dark place or a darkened place, then as the darkness increases, those rods are activated, which enable us to see at night. That's why at night you don't see color, because rods are not associated, when they're activated, they're not associated with seeing color. And at night, you don't differentiate color when everything is dark and black. You just see everything in grayscale. So light, though, light, yes. Rods are significant because, and there's like 100 million of them, 100 million of these rod cells in the eye. They're not going to help us with color vision, but my word, I mean, without them, absent of light, which enables or activates the cones and color vision, you wouldn't be able to see at night. I mean, how would that be? You know, I mean, so you'd be this person that sees with great clarity and ability, but you better not go anywhere at night because you're going to be totally incapable. So just as the God who fashioned the world in terms of, you go all the way back to the book of Genesis, right? And so you have, here's the day and here's the night. Isn't it amazing that he also made our bodies to have the capacity for night vision and to see things in the day? It's like, and even beyond that, I mean, here's a God who created the beauty of this world before it was darkened by sin and depravity and all of that. But even the sort of the vestigial beauty of the original world still here, absolutely magnificent. But what would be the sense of God creating all that and then putting creatures in it that couldn't appreciate it? And I think there's a number of ways to consider that, and one would be, well, so animals too, they can see and whatever. Okay, but for human beings, what is truly amazing is that not only can they see, but they also have the capacity of they're sentient beings, so they can reason. You can reason from what you see. And when you look on the macro level and what has been referred to as our globe as this pale, Carl Sagan. Sorry, I was fumbling there for the name Carl Sagan, as a pale blue dot. So if you take a step back and look at a satellite image and you see the Earth, and really we think it's so very, very far away, but in terms of the expanse of the galaxies, the innumerable galaxies in the universe, right? Even an image from the Hubble satellite from vast distances back on our galaxy, and you see this in almost like this galactic dust or fog, is this pale blue dot, tiny little Earth, seemingly so insignificant. And yet, if you're doing the research, and I'd encourage you, if you want, to look at a movie like The Privileged Planet, very interesting, but it goes into all of this. And it's almost like the Earth was placed at a specific region of the galaxy where there was no obfuscation. In other words, all that galactic dust I'm talking about, is not present. But if the Earth, although habitable, was placed in some other part of the galaxy, you would have all of that, if I'm using the right term, like galactic dust or debris or everything, such that, great, you can see, you can live, you can have the same experience on Earth, but you can't look out into the heavens. As if to say that the Earth was created almost as a platform, and from that platform, mankind, sentient human beings, certainly capable of much more than just Darwinian evolutionary survival, but we can reason just incredibly things about ourselves and about the vast reaches of space and so on and so forth. So the idea of design is really something to spend some time and think about, and using the eye as a launch pad. So rods capable of night vision, terrific. Cones require more light. I mean, there's 6 million of those in each eye. They're packed into the fovea, which we did, the fovea centralis. So they're packed in there, and they help us really to sharpen our ability to see images, or to sharpen the image, sharpen the detail of images. So some old people like me can go back to black and white televisions and those early TVs and so on. But then now you're seeing what 1080p, and we thought, wow, that's really amazing. Now 4K. Now it was the ultra high definition then, and now it's the 8K, and you wonder, where does this stuff end? When I was in Poland over the winter, I happened to be in a shop, and they were advertising here right in front was this 8K monitor, this 8K screen. I thought, this is just amazing. At some point, and I have to ask yourself, at what point does it matter? I mean, at what point, what 16 K? At what point can you really tell the difference between 4 and 8? And I suppose we can, and I suppose they wouldn't make it if we couldn't. But think of the detail of those images, and so you wouldn't be able to appreciate those without the cones. Without these centers that actuate the light that we receive, this stimulus of light that's actuated, the pupil, the iris, the lens, the retina, the optic nerve, the fovea, all of this, right? That actuate that give us the sense of sight and allow us to appreciate that. So let me switch over here. So light and dark and light, adaptation. This is probably just a simple example then, the follow through on vision and sight. But we're going to just call this a phenomena, like the phenomena of dark and light adaptation, and which is just a fancy way. You remember we used the term last time, sensory adaptation, and that just refers to the reduction in sensitivity to a stimulus after constant exposure. What are those stimuli? Remember, stimulus one, stimuli more than. What are the stimuli? Well, like dark and light, which we have, on the title in front of you, or heat and cold. So if you are exposed to the dark long enough, then sensory adaptation says that there is a decrease in the reduction of sensitivity to that stimulus the longer you're exposed to it. So in other words, you're in the dark for a long period of time, then that stimulus, darkness, has less of an effect on you. So why is that? So now we know, well, it's because of these rods, and these rods become actuated as the light decreases, so that by sensory adaptation I adjust to that. So, I mean, here we're saying uh, if you are going into, let's say you're going into a movie theater, which is what you have, it's got to be in Russia because you see the Russian, well, it's either the Ukraine or Russia, you see the Russian up there in top. So you're going into this place, and it's um, it's dark on the inside. What happens when you move from the light into the dark on the inside? And you're going to notice that particular sensation. You know what? Right at the beginning, you're like not able to see anything for a few minutes. Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but usually then you're walking into the theater, and by the time you get into that room, if you're a few minutes early for the movie, it's just really, really dark in there, and it takes a while. And you'll have people doing what? They get out the cell phone and they start turning on their flashlights so they can find their seat, something like that. But this all has to do with those photoreceptors, and your ability to see, your sense of light, is directly attributed to the activation of those photoreceptors, whether they are rods in this particular case, or whether they are cones in this particular case, then where you walk back out and it's bright outside, and you get a totally different sensation. So it can even involve, a particularly painful sensation. If you've been subjected to the dark long enough. So I was in southern Poland a few years ago. I took a group of Davis students, and we went. We were actually teaching English in Warsaw for 1 week, and then I said, okay, well, we'll jump a train, and we'll head to Krakow, to the south of Poland. So it's a nice train ride down. We had worked out through Airbnb, someplace to stay, and it was all great, and just sort of like walking the streets, getting our meals and things like that. But this was a purposeful trip, right? So I said a couple things I want to show you. I want to take you to Oświęcim, which Oświęcim is about a 2-hour bus ride from Krakow, and that's Oświęcim is the Polish name for the town. It was renamed by the Germans Auschwitz, and Auschwitz is where you have also in German Birkenau 1, Birkenau 2. Later they were planning Birkenau 3. These were the death camps. So it was very interesting. It's like a 7-hour tour, and you take the bus ride. You go over to take the bus ride back. But there was also something I wanted them to see, and this is called Wieliczka. Wieliczka. Okay, everybody together. Wieliczka. Now you know a Polish word. Wieliczka. It's the name of the salt mine in this community that dates all the way back to the 13th century. Can you imagine? Here's a salt mine in continuous operation from the 13th century to the year 2007 when they discontinued its use. So now it's basically like, you go to the mine entrance, and it's like a big tourist attraction now. It's a historical landmark. And so what we do is we go into Krakow, and we get a bus, a tour bus. They have these tour companies, and it's really just super cheap. And you get maybe 40, 50 of you in a group, and you'll get someone who is going to be an English guide, a guide in English, and they'll give you all of those, those little things you carry around and put the earbuds in, things like that, so you can hear what the guide is saying. So they'll take you out to Wieliczka, then the guide will stay with you, and it is so cool because you get inside, and they have these wooden stairs, not rickety. It's well built with good Polish lumber. Can you imagine? This is a 210-foot drop. So you walk. I'm telling you, listen. You walk in circles. The only other time I've walked in circles like this and this type of distance was not down but up. When I was in Cologne, Germany. I went to the cathedral there, and they have two towers, and I don't know how many. They might. I don't even want to say. I'll get it wrong, but they are more than this 210 feet. Believe me. And you know how you get inside the tower, and you just start winding with these narrow steps. I think the fellow that was with me was an engineer, and he counted 500 steps. So you figure it out. How high was that thing? But by the time so it wasn't so much going up, but coming down. Can you imagine your thighs? You know, if you've been going down that far, just aching. But I was so dizzy because it's just a small little spiral thing. This was not so bad at Wieliczka, but still, by the time you got down, you're a bit dizzy and disoriented. But then you think, hey, you know, the miners had to do this every day. Now, they brought you back up mercifully. They brought you back up by elevator. But you're thinking the miners back in the day, you know, making this drop and coming down into this area. So the hallways and everything, it's all salt everywhere. Salt floor, salt walls, salt ceiling, salt cathedrals, salt chapel. So all this stuff carved out. I mean, this is, you've got to go online. Wieliczka. That's Wieliczka. One more time. Wieliczka. Just Google Wieliczka salt mine, and there'll probably be a tab that it'll be in English. I know there is, and you can look at it. But just look at the pictures, and they didn't bring professional artists down there. These were the miners. They have chandeliers in salt. That the whole chapel is not some little room. This grand cathedral. There's an underground lake in there. There's all this stuff. All right. So why am I wasting time going into all this? To give you something interesting to listen to, but imagine the 13th century, and imagine those miners, and just miles of the tour itself is like 1.3 miles, but this is only like the tiniest fragment of the entire mines, with all of the dozens and dozens of caverns and halls and things of this nature. But imagine the darkness, and imagine adjusting to it. Then imagine you're working down in there. Even if you have just these torches and things, but then coming back up out of that. And so we have rods and cones of all things. If you never heard of them before, you just, I don't know, I have this eye. I've kind of heard, I know I have a pupil, you know, because that's the color of my eye. And I know there's a lens in there somewhere. I've heard the term retina, you know, but I bet you haven't heard the term fovea. Maybe you have. But these rods and cones, and you think, wow, God gave us those. God gave us those things by the millions, so that we could see, behold, appreciate. Now imagine your God. Wow, imagine that. But imagine your God, and you created someone with the capacity to see his handiwork, and yet that person never returns gratitude to God, or never says, or never at least compliments God on the majesty of his handiwork, and so on, or just the gift of sight. So we really should just take a moment and do that, and just thank God that you can see. And if you can't see, you know, like if you're a sightless person and you can't hear, you know, you have then the sense of touch. And then these wonderful people have developed Braille and the ability to receive information. So at least if they can't see, or never have been able to see, somehow the beauty of God's creation can be described. I don't know what that's like. Somebody trying to describe to me a color when I've never seen color, or beauty. Even if I asked you right now, give me a definition of beauty, describe beauty. But boy, it's tough, isn't it? I mean, it really is tough. and so at the very least, we should be thankful. Um, okay, so moving right along. So we have a whole bunch of slides actually here in succession, and most of these are just to sort of like test certain visual phenomena and to give examples of certain visual theories, let's say. So we want to illustrate the principle of color, and on the left you see this trichromatic theory. So there's a theory of color vision, trichromatic theory. You have your reds, your greens, and your blues. So if you have a color printer, or just inside the administration building there on campus, there's a color printer that I use. There's a one printer in the staff office, but then there's another printer sitting there right next to Julia on the right hand side. I think it's a HP printer, something like that. If you now don't do this. Don't do this without permission. But if you popped open the front of that thing, to look where you reload, and what are you going to see? You're going to see like these different colors that are going to be putting in there, and then it's the mix of these colors that allow you to print in multicolor color. This is like a chromatic scheme. It's based on kind of chromatic theory and how we understand, but how we experience sight. So the two theories, trichromatic and opponent process theory, and there's fundamental differences between the two. Trichromatic theory states that our cones, remember, the cones give us ability to see, differentiate images clearly, so on and so forth in light. They have a preference for three kinds of colors: red, green, and blue, while opponent process theory postulates or proposes that our cones, or rather remember we mentioned those ganglion cells, so our cones or retinal ganglion cells that receive the information from the cones then respond to pairs of colors like red-green that you see on top, or blue-yellow in the middle, or black-white. These are theories. So if we have only three kinds of cones, how are we able to see many colors? So one possible answer is that combinations of different light provide us with the ability to see a variety of different colors. And, I suppose there are other explanations for this. There are some like impossible colors that people talk about, like bluish yellow or reddish green, something like that. And how is it that those exist? And a proposal is that our cones are arranged in an opponent process manner, like you see on the right hand side, where the retinal ganglion cells that are that we mentioned before, these are taking color-based information from the cones and are computing the difference between the two. So we can't see bluish yellow or reddish green color. So next slides are kind of like an exercise for us. I'm going to feel like a hypnotist now for a while, but so let's have a little bit of fun here. Here's a slide that demonstrates the concept of opponent process theory. So we have the red and the blue, and you have the blue. So what I want you to do is focus your attention entirely on the center of the plus in the middle of the rectangle. So you see that plus sign. Focus your attention, and let's do this for like 30 seconds, something like that. You're just staring at it, say the center of the blue plus. Staring, 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 staring. I'm not trying to hypnotize you. Just saying, just look at it, look at it, look at it, look at it, stare at it, stare at it, stare at it, stare at it. And I don't want to take an inordinate amount of time to do this, so I just go to the next. So now, when you look at this slide, after looking at the previous image, I mean, what do you see? What color image do you see now? You're probably going to see something vaguely like a green rectangle and a yellow plus in the center, something like that. So let's take a look at this image for a moment. Again, just staring for about 30 seconds, just staring, and we're probably not going to take enough time, but just stare at this very center of the image. So just stare at the center of this. And we're looking here at the concept of the opponent process theory then. Just keep looking at the center of this object, and we probably won't be able to look quite long enough to get the full effect. Now when you look at this slide, you see what color, for example, or what color image do you see now? So you're likely going to see a full image then, after your eyes kind of adjust, a full image that is composed of a more natural color scheme, like a darker background, or the color of the woman's jacket changes to a darker mustard type of color, while her headband changes to blue, something like that. But those are just a couple of examples. Let's just finish up with what could be, again, a very complex description. Here's our rotating skull again. The primary auditory cortex we see there, right? Where hearing is generated in the brain. But if you look then at the complexity of the ear, this is not, you might look and say, hey, look, they labeled all the parts of the ear. Not even close. I mean, if you expanded on any one of those parts, then you're going to see other parts. Again, let's just default back to the notion of design and purpose and designer. So it's not just that, hey, I have an eye. I have an eye. With the eye, I can see. Isn't that great that God designed our bodies to contain an eye so that we could see? Now, you being the intelligent and newly informed college student say, yeah, that's true, but a lot more than that. You really want to talk design? Let's start talking about the individual components of the eye and how they contribute together to vision. And wow, that's not an accident. Somebody actually designed it that way, and not just designed it that way for sight, but also that the sight was purposeful for giving glory to the one who designed it. Incredible, right? Well, what about hearing? You can everything that you just rewind the thing if you have the guts to do so. Rewind the whole thing, and go back to all that digression on design and purpose, and just say, now, same thing about the ear. Here's the ear. Here's the functionality of the ear. But it's not just that it functions, but it functions with purpose, because it gives us the ability to process the stimulus of sound in such a way that we have this sense of what? Hearing, as it says on top. So this slide describes the sense of hearing. We want to describe that, and also of what it accomplishes. So we won't go into as much detail here. Just don't worry. We won't go as much detail here as with vision, but we do want to make some point about how vision functions. So here's just the simplest overview of how sound waves enter the auditory canal. Do you see that in front of you? I know it's going to be really tiny and I can't do with my iPad, just expand that larger for you. But if you can't see it, it's there from the outer ear, which you can see in, it'll say like external auditory canal, something like that. So sound waves then are going to enter in, that's the stimulus, is the sound waves, going to enter in the auditory canal, and it's going to be funneled by the pinna, which is that outside, what we properly refer to as the ear. It's the visible part of the ear that's outside of the head, but the ear is really all of these internal parts and everything. But you say even that crazy thing, that basically say, hey, you know what that's useful for? Now that my vision is so bad, it keeps my glasses on. That's what that's for. And it's the pinna, is this thing that it's catching it. It's catching it. If it was liquid, you'd say, well, what do? I take a funnel, and I use a funnel as to take liquid and to channel it purposefully into a container or something. So imagine sound waves the same way. So sound waves are being channeled, forced, if you will, collected, received by the pinna, and it's funneling it then down through this external auditory canal. And then, because of the nature of sound waves, okay, so just the sense, and I couldn't even begin to go into detail on sound waves and various pitches and frequencies and all that, but just to say that these sound waves are vibrations, and they're vibrating the tympanic membrane, and the ossicles, like icicles, or popsicle, something like that. So they're vibrating the tympanic membrane. You see the tympanic captivity there, captivity. I can't. This is how bad my glasses are. The tympanic cavity. So it's vibrating this and these ossicles before reaching the cochlea. The cochlea is what produces the nerve impulses. We've probably heard of this, right? The cochlea. That's something that is more familiar. So here's vibrations vibrating the tympanic membrane and these ossicles even before reaching the cochlea. Now the ossicles. So ossicles being plural because you have the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. These three components. These three ossicles. I would say individually an ossicle, but these three ossicles. Again, you could talk about each one of those. What's the role of each one of those? How do they contribute to the processing of these sound waves or vibrations by means of the tympanic membrane and the ossicles, and then finally to the cochlea. So we should say something also about what is not on there, and that would be these auditory hair cells. Auditory hair cells. These are fascinating as well, but it's these auditory hair cells that convert sound waves into electrical signals. Can you imagine that? So here, God has designed the eye in a particular way so that we have the sense of vision, but he's also designed the ear in a particular way, and all these component parts, that we have the sense of hearing. But can you imagine these things that you really can't even detect that they are even working? You just hear. Now, if you turn the volume up too high or too low or something, then you experience, some issues with that. But you're walking out through the day. You hear the birds chirping, or you hear an airplane going overhead. You just hear sound. You just hear. And there's no switch you have to turn on or anything. And these auditory hair cells are converting sound waves into electrical signals. It's those impulses then that are conveyed by nerves to other receptors, and so on, so on, so on, right? So this is how it gets to what? The primary auditory cortex, which you see spinning there on the right hand side, you know. That is what's going to basically process all of that into the sense of hearing. Right, so auditory hair cells, these are sensory receptors that detect movement in their environment. So again, sound waves, vibrations, movement, and though it's not particularly detectable to you, you just experience the sense of hearing, but it is these receptors, these auditory hair cells. There are inner auditory hair cells and there are outer. And the relation of these two, okay, so the inner are what detect the sound and the outer are what amplify the sound. So this is just the very skimming of the surface of this subject, enough to really appreciate the complexity of our design, but also the specificity. Okay, what would the sense of complexity be? A bunch of scrambled letters on a page without specificity. The specificity is, here are individuated components of the ear put together in such a way that each one has a purpose, but that they are all interrelated for a greater purpose, and then within the ear, with the body, in conjunction with the eye, and so on, and where you have vision, hearing, touch, smell, and taste all functioning together to deliver what we would say is multimodal perception. So in other words, vision does one thing, regardless of whether hearing is engaged or not. Hearing does one thing, with regardless of whether vision or touch is engaged. But there are occasions where you have the multimodal perception. And that is where everything is sort of engaged at the same time, and it delivers a sense of perception. And since we're talking not primarily about anatomy or biology, but about psychology, then if someone says, well, I was an eyewitness of that event, and why do you have different reports by individuals who claim to have seen something? How is it that they perceive slightly differently? And you might say, well, that's because they were standing at different angles and so on, something like that. But could that also have something to do with multimodal perception? I mean, what if that to which they bear witness was more touch than hearing, or was more vision than smell or taste, or maybe their multimodal perception focused more on the smell or the odor and less on what they heard and less on what they saw, right? So psychologically, really, you could take this all back, and when you're sitting down and questioning somebody that claims to have had an experience, pay careful attention to what sense they're highlighting and to what degree, and perhaps to the exclusion of other senses. So for example, you might say, so I just wanted to ask you about your experience. You claim to have that experience. I just want to ask you a few questions, like, could you tell me as best as you could, what you saw? What did you see? What did you hear? I mean, did you hear anything? Were you able to feel anything? In other words, was it hot? Was it cold? Was there anything sensitive to your touch? Were there any particular odors emitted? What was at the scene? Or something. So this is where we have. It's more so in psychology than just saying, well, it's what the mind processes, but the mind perceives, right? So we have all these senses, and stimuli are processed through the sensory capacities that we have, all these channels, into at times multimodal ability to perceive something, and that perception is now what we do with it. What did we conclude from all of that? So perception is something cognitive. You know, sensation is tactile for the most part. Um, you know, maybe not always, but like with vision, it's tactile if you get a bright light in your eye and it causes you to shut your eyes quickly or look away or something. There's a very marked sensation, but tactile is sort of like I prick you with a pin, or you have goosebumps, that something like that. It's something that is really felt, okay. But when you come to perception, then it's more cognitive. It's what does your mind infer from that? What do you deduce? What do you perceive? And we go back to that simple saying: perception is reality. And so that is reality for that person until maybe they can be told that maybe your vision, your visual sense was impaired in some way, or your hearing or something. And so we're going to leave it there, and hopefully the next time we pick up will be face-to-face in class. But I do appreciate you guys suffering through these videos, and hopefully we got the information to you appropriately. So see you soon, Lord willing.